usually if a child's having trouble with academics, there's something going on that's an underlying cause, and it's not a lack of workbooks. That's never your underlying cause, right? Most kids are getting a lot of practice with the academic skills they need. So if we're seeing them falling behind, the problem may be their brain needs something else.
Hi, this is Liz Weaver, and you are listening to the Learning Success Podcast, an information-packed podcast with the latest news, information, and tips to help you overcome a learning difficulty. For anyone suffering from a reading difficulty, writing difficulty, a math difficulty, a focus problem, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, or ADHD, this is the place for you. The Learning Success Podcast is brought to you by LearningSuccessSystem.com.
Hello and welcome to the Learning Success Podcast. I'm Phil Weaver, and today we have with us Marla Szwast. Marla is a mom who writes in the cracks of time between educating, chauffeuring, and feeding half a dozen kids. And I bet they're a hungry half dozen kids, I would imagine. So Marla Szwast lives in Marietta, Georgia with her husband and 6 children, 2 dogs, 1 cat, and a sun canur. You can tell me if I pronounced that right. I know it's a bird.
Yes.
She is passionate about teaching children in a developmentally appropriate way, nourishing their mind, body, and heart. She is the author of Stepping Through History, Starting with Yourself. Her homeschool blog focuses on how the brain learns, covering topics such as cognitive and neuroscience, along with practical tips on how to incorporate that knowledge into your everyday homeschool life. Marla is the founder and writer behind www.jumpintogenius.com. And today we will be speaking about beyond homework, more ways you can help your child learn. So hello, Marla.
Hi.
It's great to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Good. So I want to jump right into what I think is one of the most important points here, something that you can talk about, and that is the malleability of intelligence. Okay, I think that I know and I have a lot of experience with the fact that our society assumes that we have a static intelligence, that we get what we're born with. And I'm going to read from one of your blog posts. It says, "It has been shown over and over that hard work and the belief that you can learn are the only ingredients needed to shatter your own previous barriers of intelligence." So, Marla, can you speak to that for us?
Well, I guess, that idea that intelligence is fixed, there's a lot of history with that, and we haven't quite shifted our mindsets for what the science actually says now.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think what first got me so interested in that idea was actually my father, who believed he was very stupid because he didn't do well in school.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was told year after year by teacher after teacher that he was just dumb and he would never do anything great. And as I started becoming an adult, I look around at the other adults around me and I realized my dad is one of the most intelligent people I know.
Yeah.
He knows so many things on so many topics, and it's all self-taught, and it's because he spent so many hours of his life as an adult reading things. And so to me, that just made that idea that it is not fixed a part of my life, because I knew someone who really had changed. Even if he didn't necessarily he doesn't think of himself as smart or intelligent, but everyone around him knows that he is.
Right.
And so, there's so many studies showing that our brains do grow, and learning things creates new connections, and the more connections we have, then when we encounter something new, there's more things to connect it with. So
Sure.
Learning actually even becomes easier. The more we learn, the easier it is to learn more things.
Right. We're growing our capabilities. Yeah. So in that, what I quoted, you said, and the belief that you can learn. So that has a lot about other people's expectations, which is what you said about your father. Teachers were telling them.
Right.
I also know quite a number of very intelligent people that still don't believe that they are intelligent in exactly the same way. They, some of them had a specific learning disability growing up, and they assumed with dyslexia, because of that specific learning disability, they assumed that, and we're told that they were not intelligent.
Yeah.
I do know, you mentioned the history, and I do know that the history of the intelligence malleability actually goes back into like the late 1700s. There were actually some evidence back there. The real strong evidence came in the 30s, but it was just widely disputed. Nobody believed it, and now we're at a point where it's absolutely proven. But I think that a lot of the educational world, I'm sorry I'm taking this over, but this is a big
That's
part.
all right.
This is a really big, strong belief.
I do
how
have an
important
idea
this.
about why it's hard to believe, though.
Okay, yeah, I want to hear it. So, but we do know that there's so many examples of the educational world and even professionals outside of it in education still clinging on to this belief that it's not, and it's extremely damaging to kids. So yes, please.
Well, because an intelligent person has more connections and more information in their brain, when they encounter new information, they're going to pick it up more quickly. So it's hard for us to believe that what we might call slow kids won't always be slow, because they're not picking it up as fast as the other kids.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a sort of trajectory that you can take to overcome that. And I've seen that specifically with two of my own kids.
Okay.
One who had several learning disabilities, and one who's just learning's just too easy for him in a lot of ways.
So both ends of the spectrum.
Both ends of the spectrum, right next to each other, sort of in age. And yes, I got to see that hard work and doing a lot of these things with neurocognitive science actually put the child who had these learning issues in the positions where other people, when he meets them, now he's 16 now, he's doing college courses, and other people think he's super smart.
Right.
And I laugh about it. He's starting to laugh about it too, because he remembers how hard it was for him to learn how to read, because he had dyslexic issues also.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, he now has a strength that the smart kids around him don't.
He has grit.
Because he knows it doesn't matter if he's failing. All he has to do is keep working. And he has to work harder than everyone around him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he will catch up and move past.
And move past is the key.
And move past, I would say, yeah.
Yeah. We see that in a lot of examples of people that something comes difficult to them, learning or whatever, that they're building, if they push through, if they do the work, they're building grit. And grit has been shown to be probably the most successful indicator of future success.
Yeah.
And so you may even consider it an asset, because I've taught martial arts for 25 years, and I can tell you that people that are physically capable, that have coordination that comes natural to them, always fail, because they didn't because they're going to run into a point in the specific martial art to teach. It's very difficult. It takes it's a huge cognitive load building the coordination. And when things come easy, they don't build that grit, and they tend to give up.
Yeah.
And so to where somebody who's built grit, they're like, okay, this is hard. That was hard. No big deal. I'm used to hard. Right. And they just go. Right. And so, if they push through, then it becomes an asset. Yeah. Which is awesome. Okay. So, you talked about convincing being a major factor in this. So, what do you mean by that? How would you convince?
Well, kids don't know what's going to be on the other side of all the hard work necessarily. So in some ways, to me, when we're dealing with children, the parents and the teachers around them really have to be the ones that believe it. Yeah. And keep pushing and keep saying, I know it's hard, but we're going to work on it, and it's going to be easier for you later, and I know you can do it. And we
Mm-hmm.
have to believe past all of their own self-doubts.
Right. Expectations. Are you familiar with the study? There was a study done, I don't know what year, it's old, but they brought kids into, at the beginning of the school year, they gave the teachers a series different, I don't know how many were in the study, but it was a pretty big number, and they gave each teacher the child's IQ score at the beginning of the school. And then at the end of the school year, they matched up the IQ scores that they had given to the teachers to the grades at the end of the years. And they correlated almost perfectly, like at 95% correlation or something like. The only problem was the IQ scores were lies. They had randomly given out the scores. And that's not a good, trick to
No, that's not a good.
I mean, I'm sure I would hope that all of the psychological, getting a study in place would prohibit this type of study.
Right.
But it was done, and it really shows a truth there that it's about expectation, right?
Yeah.
It is. I think as a child I was considered unintelligent when I was in kindergarten and the beginning of first grade, and I don't think I was, but I was very shy, and that made the assumption. And I can remember a friend of mine going and showing, the teacher was going over his math test, and she was just praise, you're so smart and this and that, and I was looking over his shoulder and I was doing the equations in my head, and for some reason I spoke out and said, I can do that, and she laughed. And
oh wow.
Yeah, and then I think it was just a knee-jerk reaction for her, because she wasn't a mean person that I remember, but she was like, okay, and gave it to me, and I did it 100% score, and that was a deciding factor. I think that changed the course of my life, just that moment.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, of course, it should be obvious, but I'm going to ask the question: what effect does putting them in dumbed-down classes have? So.
Well, yeah, pretty bad. My husband and I used to say, if our oldest had, if he had been in public school during the first several years, it would have destroyed him.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of parents have to answer the question, how can they combat the problems? Because the child's going to come home with the message that they're just dumb, and therefore they don't need to try. And that's really when they're going to start creating the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. So they're going to get they're going to get the message, and they're going to be set on a different trajectory as well.
Yeah.
To where they'll never
So for most kids, I mean, in extreme cases, there might be a place for a special ed classroom for extreme cases.
Sure.
But for most kids with more mild learning disabilities, ADD, things like this, it's time for us to start expecting them to be able to overcome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Expect.
And to expect teachers to be trained and knowledgeable in the help that they need to give to that child, or what special assistance they might need, or what they can encourage the parents to do at home to help them, because that child is going to have to work harder than all the other kids in the class.
Mm-hmm.
But they're just as smart as them.
Right. But do you think they're going to have to work harder their entire life, or their intelligence will develop?
I think intelligence does develop.
Mm-hmm.
There's only one subject that my son still struggles with,
mm-hmm.
and that's spelling.
Okay.
And it doesn't affect his reading. It doesn't really affect the ideas behind his writing. He's been reading past a 12th grade level since he was in 6th grade, even though he had dyslexia.
Uh-huh.
So, in a lot of ways, he doesn't have to work that hard to learn anymore.
Okay, so things
been taking a full college load of classes and just knocks off his homework quickly.
So some things are becoming.
It's easy except for spelling.
Okay, so he's still got something to
He
figure
still
out
can't seem to master
there.
spelling yet. Yeah.
But other things have become automatic.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
the basic, the foundational skills of learning
Right.
have
Right.
been improved, and it sounds like pretty dramatically.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Quite dramatically. Yes. When he was in 5th grade, we thought he would never learn how to do long division.
Your expectation there, huh?
Yes. We had been trying so hard for so long. Like, we were super frustrated. We're like, he's never going to get it. But we never let him see that.
Okay.
That was like our own thing, you know, behind closed doors. And we'd come back out every day and we'd do more long division.
Okay. That's interesting.
And now he's on track with math. He's not ahead,
Mm-hmm.
but he's on track for the typical, you know, when he's done with high school, he will have finished Algebra 2 and trigonometry.
Okay. So thinking about this, you know, when I know that IEPs are actually, and I know you're a homeschooler, but just can we relay this into the public system?
Yeah.
But I know that IEPs are just becoming more and more popular, and people are seeking out that. But in reality, that's a pretty serious question of whether there should be an IEP, because these factors are going to come in. The expectations are going to be dropped, and that. Would you agree with that? That parents should seriously consider not?
In some ways, yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because then it does tend to become an excuse. I know a lot of other parents who have kids with ADD or ADHD.
Yep.
And our son has that, but we never told him because we weren't in school. We didn't have to tell him. And
Sure.
no one else was going to tell him, right?
Right.
He sort of self-realized it about a year ago. So when he was 15, he was like, do I have that? And we're like, oh, well, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
In the meantime, these other kids that have known it from a young age are using it as an excuse.
Oh, yeah.
It's an excuse for not working hard. It's an excuse for everything they do wrong. And it's holding them back from trying hard. So I think in a lot of ways, the labels are not helpful to our children unless there's a really specific therapy that you're going to use.
Okay.
Which was sort of our decision in the end, was that we weren't going to use drugs as a therapy, therefore we didn't need a medical diagnosis, and we had screened him out for other problems that would have different, like we screened him out for auditory processing disorder.
Okay.
And things like that. So it's a fine line, and
right.
The concept behind an individualized education plan, like just the concept of the education being tailored to where the child's at within each subject, is really, I think it's a great concept, but that's not exactly what it ends up being.
Right. From what I've seen,
the system,
it can be more of a warehouse.
Right. That's not exactly, because I think one of the things that helped my son was to let him explore his strengths when he was little.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew from a pretty young age that he knew a lot more chemistry than any other kids. So he had specific things he was good at to help his confidence.
Exactly. Right. And there's research that shows very clearly that confidence is transferable.
Yeah.
So if so it's partially a chemical state within the body. So if you can have something like that you're confident in, then with a few tactics, you could transfer that confidence to something else. Right.
It kept him from really feeling like he was dumb.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because he's always got that.
I guess with an IEP, you have to weigh the message you're sending your child to what the benefit to having those things that you're trying to get in place are really going to provide long term.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of our problem is that we're so obsessed with what grade we're getting even in elementary school that we're not willing to just put in the extra time and effort over several years.
Right.
To wait for the fruit to come later. We want the D to be an A now.
That's an important point, and the reality is grades in elementary school really don't matter much. Right? Nobody will see it. Nobody will ever see them.
Yeah.
It's more about becoming a learner in those age and figuring out during those years. But
Yeah.
of course, it's easy. I can imagine as a parent, it's going to be easy to panic when your
Yes.
second
Yes,
grader is failing.
very easy. Yeah.
And hard to keep those in mind, that elementary school grades is just a method to say, hey, we need to course correct or something, right?
Right.
Rather than
Right.
going into panic.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So, learning styles. Let's talk about learning styles a little bit.
Okay.
And I know you have some opinions on learning styles. Can you tell me about that?
Well, learning styles are very big in the homeschooling world. So one of the first things homeschoolers get thrown at is the idea that some people are auditory, and so you should give them information through their ears. Some people are kinesthetic, so they need to be moving to learn anything. And some people are visual, so they need to see everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I read all those things, and for the first several years, I thought there was some truth to it, but it seemed a little disjointed to me, especially because it didn't make sense to me that I had to buy a separate curriculum for every child and teach them all differently, which really is a trend in that education.
So it might be a money trend, right?
I kind of started thinking, it makes more sense if you just hit all of the modes of learning.
Yeah.
And later I read the cognitive science in Why Don't Students Like School by Daniel Willingham.
Mm-hmm.
He goes into the cognitive science that showed that really just because someone scored auditory on one of those tests and then they were presented with audio information or video information, it didn't actually affect their retention of the information.
Right.
And he goes into saying that it is good to get information in, but it's more dependent on what makes sense for that information set.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I think again, we tend to think of the brain like a computer, like which way is it going to work best and all that, and that's another fallacy is the learning style.
Yeah.
The reality is, I think humans have known for probably thousands of years that we combine all of those for learning.
Yeah.
The ancient Greek orators. Are you familiar with the?
Yes.
What did they call it? The memory palace, right? Where they were memorizing those long speeches by visualizing going through a palace or anything spatial, right?
Yeah.
And so that we know that I think that all of those three connect at the spatial level. We have our proprioception and our interoception. That's obviously spatial. We're our body in space.
Yeah.
Our visual is spatial, but even auditory, we pick up where is the sound coming from, and those connect through the spatial. So and you mentioned the spelling. There's some theories about people who are trying to spell or that are poor spellers are trying to use their auditory completely, and it's not a good memory for spelling. And when they switch to visual, and it may not be that they're weak in visual, it's just like they hadn't tried it that way,
Right. Yeah, and our modern spelling is a very it's kind of a weird skill.
It is.
Because there's all these rules, but we sort of made all the rules up to explain a very complex system that doesn't really follow the rules.
Right. So.
And I've tried all the methods with my son.
Yeah. Hasn't clicked yet, huh?
No, nothing's clicked quite yet.
Probably will at some point, right? So that brings us so that's talking about abstractions. I know you've got some material on fostering abstract thought.
Yeah. Abstract thought is difficult, and actually kids probably aren't even going to be capable of it until maybe 12 or so.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times we push them from very young to try to come up with abstract ideas. But abstract ideas are actually based off of non-abstract ideas.
It's another layer.
yes, it's another layer. And when we haven't put that layer in yet, and we're trying to get this certain kind of thought out of them, it's just not going to work. So I think we sort of recognize in our society that we need that layer of abstract thought. We need to be deep thinkers, but we've sort of thrown out all the facts. We don't really want to focus on learning facts or memorization or repetition anymore because it's been done in a pretty boring way for a lot of years.
Yes.
And we want learning to be fun again. So we're throwing all that out, and we're going to try to teach abstract thought. But you can't skip the base layer because the brain has nothing to work with.
Yeah. You have to have something to abstract, right?
Right.
Yeah, interesting. And then, of course, numbers and letters in that are abstractions. So if those foundations aren't built, I can see
and
some
numbers and letters are a good example of why we do need to memorize things. We can't learn to read if we don't know our letter sounds. It's not going to happen. We can't get to the next step. And it's really doing children a disservice to just try to skip memorizing the letters and go straight to trying to teach them how to read.
Right. Those, again, going back to those things, those foundational skills not being built in, it's then not automatic, and they're just going to struggle.
Right.
There's too much cognitive load going on.
Yes.
Right. So,
yeah.
Again, going back to the idea of that you build the foundations by doing that step by step, you're reducing cognitive load because the other parts of our brain take over. Is that correct?
Yes. And because, well, I guess a couple reasons. One, there's only so much space in our working memory. So if we try to make them keep too much stuff in there, as soon as their brain thinks that we've given them a problem that's too hard for them to solve, it's going to drop the problem.
Right. Yeah, there is.
They're going to enter stress. As they drop the problem, they'll also be entering a stress state, and their brain will be like, this isn't important, something's wrong, because you're upset.
Yes. That's actually my experience. I still do, like I said, I've been teaching Kung Fu for 25 years. It's a very, very complex Kung Fu. And I have had, this is very common for adults to say, stop, my brain hurts, I can't take it. And their body is just revolting, and they literally cannot take any more input because they're full. You can tell that their working memory, their RAM, I tell them, is full. It's not taking anymore. And if you keep going that. So that's an interesting point. If you create the automaticity that the subconscious is then doing that work, it's offloaded. If we go to the computer model, you've got a graphics card we're doing the work rather than the CPU. That's a good explanation. Good. Okay, good. So we should be memorizing things. We should be working on that, but in a funner way. Is that what you said?
Yes, because the minute a kid's bored, their brain's gonna shut it out.
Yeah, boredom is a lack of dopamine, and dopamine is what creates learning.
Yeah, they need to be engaged.
So you've got strategies in your homeschool.
Yeah, I did a lot of crazy things, especially when my kids were little. Like if I had little boys learning words, I would put the words on sticky notes on the wall and give them a fly swatter, and they would swat the word to recognize it as I said it.
Right, and you're getting some movement there too.
Right. Which just helps because little boys are not yet built to sit still at the ages of 5 and 6 and 7.
No, they're not.
It's not time yet. So we didn't sit down very often while we were learning how to read.
So that makes sense. So you're, I actually have a student that he's a little bit unusual. He's the most kinesthetic learner I've ever seen. I mean, to an extreme. He's Asperger's, but he would actually jog and read. and he's a very fast, good runner. And he would actually, I would see him going down the road he still does it. He's in college, still
Wow.
does it. And so the movement, I don't know if there's a connection there. So I know you talk about the neocortex and the brain mapping. So going back to the computer model of the brain, we've, especially like with dyslexia, I know Broca's area, which is one of the language areas, and the Wernicke's area, and the angular gyrus, I think I have that right, are all these language areas. And so that we make this assumption that if this is the, the area where we perceive language, and this is the area that creates speech, that if those areas are not quite right, that's going to be that way forever. Okay, and so it sounds like you might disagree with that with the brain mapping stuff.
Well, yes, and I guess some of that was a book I read by Jeff Hawkins, who was he's a scientist who's trying to figure out how to create artificial intelligence.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so he's studying neuroscience, trying to figure out how to replicate it.
Mm-hmm.
And the deeper he dug into some of the studies and things, the more he realized that when we do a scan, sure, maybe this part of our brain's activating, but then what about someone who's blind, and
yes.
then we scan them, and they're using the so-called vision part of their brain to hear.
Right.
And they can hear better than us because they're using more brain space.
Mm-hmm.
And then the really interesting studies were with blind people who they were creating some sort of device so that they could sort of see. It wasn't a really clear thing, but they could see some shadows and things, and then
I've seen the experiments on that. They checked
their part of the brain. It wasn't even the vision center.
Oh, really? Okay.
That they were using. It wasn't, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that part.
They didn't default to going back to the vision center. I forget what it was. It might have been smell. It was something odd that like no one expected.
Okay.
And
well, there's synesthesia, which is, people perceive colors as sound or taste and things like that. So that would make sense.
Right. And so he had pulled up some research that sort of showed that like even these areas, what we use what part of the brain for, doesn't matter as much as we think it does. And that the brain itself is adaptable, and it'll just use a different area if it needs to.
Yes.
And you can also see that in some traumatic brain injuries or stroke cases where people made just really amazing and unexpected recoveries, even though a large part of their brain wasn't functioning. The rest of their brain was able to relearn and take over a lot of functions.
Yeah, I know that there are people that have literally half of a brain because it was removed because of epilepsy, and they're functioning just fine with literally half a brain.
Yeah.
They cut it out. So
he really got into how our brain actually, we think we're seeing things, but we're receiving tiny basic bits of data, kind of like a computer does.
Mm-hmm. And
we can receive that anywhere in our brain.
Yeah.
And our brain will learn how to interpret that data.
Right. And I think that's another, which I'll be a bit controversial in the dyslexia world, the assumption is, okay, if Broca's area is weak, you're always going to have this weakness. And I think that's, like you said earlier, those expectations are could have the potential of damaging somebody, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that's something that's going on in the learning disabilities world and all that, and that I think we should raise our expectations.
Yeah.
I know some of the mapping stuff that they did, you're talking about, there's lots of experiments like that. There's some where they connected to the tongue. There's some where they connected to the back because it was a big area and they had little pinpricks and they could actually see you use that. I'll give my own because I've actually personally experienced it. So I lost one eye at 19, lost vision in it. Okay. And when you lose one eye, you don't have depth perception, because depth perception is
Right.
parallax. You need two eyes to parallax. And it was scary. You know, I was a waiter in a fancy restaurant, and pouring wine, not so good. You know? Driving was bad. I live in the country. The roads are pretty windy, and that was scary for me. And the fact that I do kung fu, punches being thrown at me all the time. So depth perception was important in my life,
Right.
And one of the things that I really like to do, as you live in the country, I live in the country, is I like to do running, backcountry running, you know, and maybe off trails where you're jumping up and down rocks and stuff. And I literally could not tell if jumping off a rock was 3 feet or 30 feet. And it kind of hinders that a bit, right?
Yeah.
Over several years, I one day realized that I had depth perception. I didn't know how I did it. I just figured out that, hey, I'm able to block punches. I'm able to jump off of rocks and know how far down it is and all that. And it took me some time, and I finally figured out that I'm processing perspective differently. And so, because the depth perception would go away if my head was perfectly still, but as long as it was moving, it doesn't work on a computer screen because everything has the same perspective. But if I'm outdoors, then things in the foreground move differently than things in the background.
Right.
And so, you know, everybody has this ability to process perspective, but when I move my head, I see the perspective of everything changing. Like everything, I'm massively aware of, you know, this is moving different than this, and I can see, and I know the depth of everything. I did not have that ability when I first lost my eye. So my theory is that I lost my left eye, so therefore the right occipital lobe would no longer have a use, and that's a huge part of our brain because there's no signal going there. And so probably what happened is that remapped to have a stronger sense of perception, and that gave me back my depth perception.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's more than just studies that I know this stuff is real.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And with the Kung Fu, we'll talk about cross-lateral motion here. I'll just save that for this. But yeah, it's amazing, and we need to realize more and more that our brain does this.
Yeah.
And that we're not stuck with the brain that we're born with, right?
Right.
Right. So I know you're big on movement in the brain.
Yes.
You tell me about what about movement in the brain? Why is it important?
Well, there's so many reasons it's important.
Right, I know. But I want to hear it from you.
First, I'll just say our brain uses a ton of oxygen.
Yes.
And I would say right now, the average kid in the United States is not getting enough oxygen to their brain to develop to their full potential of intelligence. It's just not happening because we're not moving much as a society.
Right.
So we need oxygen. But the brain actually wires itself while we're moving.
Yeah.
Movements create neural connections. They create more pathways in our brain. And
neurogenesis as well.
Yes.
So not only neuroplasticity, but
new growth in the brain is created by movement. And it's why we have occupational therapists.
Yep.
For one thing. And a lot of the things that kids with learning difficulties need have to do with movement.
Yes, they do.
So I think it's important for all kids. I don't think any of our kids are really moving enough.
Well, of course.
Especially if the child if there's something in their brain that's not working quite right, then we need to give it extra food, so to speak. And one of those foods is moving. And my son still needs to move. He needs to move hard, like 4 hours a day. And of course, it took us a while to realize just how much exercise he needed a day.
Yeah.
But I would say it's his primary therapy, and we'll notice within 2 days if he doesn't have that. He'll start acting like he has ADD again. Whereas the rest of the time, no one else is going to know.
Right. Yeah. I know. I injured a foot.
I don't know if his brain just needs more oxygen or if it's still working on building and connecting extra stuff. He's 16, so he's still growing.
So he's not to the neuron pruning stage yet.
No.
He's right there. No. He's moving into that stage.
Yeah.
So his brain is completely changing at this point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we started with jiu-jitsu with him.
Good.
And he had that for 3 hours a week. And we always knew that was part of his therapy, and we would never take it away for any problems we were having. You know, sometimes you want to take the sports away from your kids when you're having discipline problems or something. Well, that's not always the best option.
It may be the worst option.
It might be the worst option. Maybe you should assign the sport.
Right.
So we started with that, and then he just went through. He's a very excited, enthusiastic kid, so he tried a lot of different sports. And in the last couple of years, he landed on dancing and musical theater, and so he's in like a ballet company. So
that's probably one of the top movement things you can do.
Yeah, and he just craves it. He craves it like nothing else. Why? In some ways, we don't understand the connections between exactly what happens. We can see some things happening in the brain, but why they happen, we have no idea.
With the ballet? Or
just in general, like, why does moving affect our brains so much? But I guess I want to say, like, humans didn't used to view themselves as a mind and a body.
Sure.
And we really still have that disconnect in how we think.
Yeah.
If we're struggling with academics, we want to push more academics. If you look all the way back at like ancient Greece, their physical programs were very rigorous.
Yes.
Like a whole section of their education was just being physically fit. Well, and in a way it was practical because they had to be ready to go to war. But in some ways, I think maybe they just understood that these things affect each other.
Well, a couple of things there. Back then, that warriors were the scholars. Those
yes, that's true.
Were not sweat. The most intelligent people, and you look at, some of the ancient philosophers and all that. They were warriors, and these things, movement and this exercise and the physical fitness, were very connected. Even in our own history, going back into what was going on the playgrounds in the 50s and 60s and before until now, it's a very, very different thing.
Right. Now we have this idea of the dumb jock, which I don't even know how that got started.
No.
It makes no sense to me. And I see other kids in his ballet program, and they're at the studio 5 hours a night practicing, and they're still taking advanced classes at high school and getting A's in all of them and going into like medical school when they're done. Right. And it's just amazing. Like, other people look at that and they're like, how did they have time? And it's like, well, their brain's so lit up, they don't need as much time to answer their questions.
Yep. Of course, I'm a big fan of teaching Kung Fu to kids, but if I had a second choice, if I could not do Kung Fu, it would be ballet. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And this has my theory as to why that movement is one, if you think about like the robotic sciences, they've got some really amazing things going on in robotics right now. But compare those absolutely things which we just think is astounding as a robot and compare it to what a human can do.
Yeah.
It's nothing, right?
Yeah, there is no comparison.
There's nothing. So movement, learning to coordinate new movements, and especially complex movements, is intense cognitive load.
Yeah.
Right? What could you possibly have out there? I mean, just name one thing that has more cognitive load than ballet, right? Well, Kung Fu, but that's it. I mean, seriously, if you've ever, have you tried it yourself? Do you know how hard it is?
Yes, I take adult dance classes at the studio. And I think it's one of the best things adults can do to keep their minds fit.
Absolutely.
And it's very difficult. And we need the teachers to be really understanding of our adult state of the brain, because we cannot learn as quickly. We hit our cognitive load much faster than the little kids that are doing ballet.
Oh yeah, they're primed for it. But
Yeah.
what I have seen in adults is if they keep up on something like that, their abilities to learn will be magnified over time, and not that much time.
True.
So I think that, we assume that as adults we're slower.
Yeah.
And we've been told they are, but if we practice it and do our mental workouts, it may not be true. I've seen it to not be true.
Yeah, one difference a teacher noticed over the summer when there was no classes for either kids or adults was that the adults remembered all the moves that they had learned the previous year, and the kids came back and had forgotten a lot.
Interesting.
So that was one big difference. Once we know it, it seems to just stay in more easily, even though none of us were practicing during the summer.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So going back to the ballet, and I'll tell you, so all dance is good. For the brain.
Yeah.
I'm convinced ballet is the best, and the reason is it has a couple of principles that are very similar to what we use in Kung Fu. The first is called center line. We call center line. I don't know what they call it in ballet, but they do it. I've seen it, right? And that has to do with posture. So your posture is perfectly straight, and of course all your movements are around that. Then and holding that center line takes a lot of processing. Balancing takes a lot of processing. As a matter of fact, in Kung Fu, one of the primary things that we do is we upset the person's brain by taking them off balance. And first, the most thing, because then all of the autonomic processes put all of the brain's processing into trying to get their balance back, which means they're completely defenseless. They cannot do anything because the whole brain is taken over by trying to regain balance.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in Kung Fu, we do that to our opponent, but we also train our own to have this amazing balance. Okay. Ballet is doing the exact same thing. Yeah. Okay. And because the other reason is it is a very precision dance, to where other dance forms, you're allowed to stylize it.
Right.
You're putting your own flair in that. Or we could say you're doing it your way, and you're not doing quite the precision that you would in ballet.
Yeah.
And there's where your difference is in different dance between ballet and the other dance forms. They're all good.
Right. But there's a certain level of minute motor control that is demanded in ballet.
Way beyond in ballet than the other dance forms. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And then you get into the upper level ballet, the real pros, and then they're incorporating the feeling of their emotions into that also, and that's
right. They're acting while they do all those amazing things.
Exactly. So how much cognitive load is that? Right? They're acting. Exactly. Crazy. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. So as you can see, I might be a big proponent of movement.
Do you have a smart child who is struggling in school? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Do you feel like the struggle is holding your child back from their true potential? Maybe the anxiety and worry over your child's future just beats you down every day. You don't have to live that way. Learn how to stop a learning disability from becoming a life disability. A child with a learning disability is stressful for the child and the parent. The disability may be eroding their confidence and shattering their self-esteem. Other people may perceive your child as unintelligent and antisocial. If not addressed and fixed early, the child may develop permanent challenges later in life when looking for a good job or meeting a potential spouse. Our current school system does not know how to properly help our children, but at Learning Success, we do. We've created a system you can easily do at home with your child, and with just 15 minutes per day after school with your child, you can save them from a life of struggle and heartbreak. Learn how to unleash your child's potential and embrace their true intelligence. As a special gift for being a loyal podcast listener, we're going to give you a free trial of the Learning Success System. Try it out absolutely free for 15 days. If it is not the perfect fit to help your child succeed in school and in life, just cancel before the trial ends and pay nothing. You even get to keep the free bonuses. Go to www.learningsuccesssystem.com/podcast to get your free trial now. You'll be so happy you did once you see the great grades your child is capable of getting. Imagine being so proud of your child when they bring home a great report card and hand it over with a beaming smile. Get your free trial now at www.learningsuccesssystem.com/podcast. You've got nothing to lose except the stress and anxiety that is holding you and your child down. I'll see you there.
Outdoor play. You're doing a lot of outdoor play with kids.
Yes. In fact, we have something called a swerfer, which is a giant swing you can stand on, and it'll take like 250 pounds. So my 16-year-old, still, he goes on the swerfer and he swings standing up on it for an hour whenever he has free time, and he'll just be out there. He's usually singing at the same time.
Increased, yeah. So
and
balance.
That's a form of sort of self-therapy that he has.
Yeah, there's so there are experiments that show that the same cognitive load that you might be using with singing or talking or anything, counting backwards or whatever. So they did experiments with, and this is all done in older adults because what they're trying to do is prevent falls and stuff like that. Right. And so they did walking exercises, and they measured the pace of the walk and the consistency of the walk, and then applied a cognitive load, like, count backwards by 2s from 100 or something, whatever it was. And it was very clear that when they were forced to do an additional cognitive load, that the walking would become slower or more erratic or whatever. So they're proving that the two things are connected.
Yeah.
That we're using the same parts of the brain, at least overlap, right?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that it was your son that does that, singing while surfing, which is, if you go back to all of our playground games, like, jumping rope, what do girls do? Jumping rope, right?
Yeah.
Rhymes, singing,
all
of those things. There it is, right? That's extreme cognitive load.
Yeah, for a lot of years, I'd read about some of these things, and I just realized so much of it's just natural to children. And I would just, when we didn't have a big yard, I would just drive to a park every morning and let them loose for half an hour, and then we'd go home and do our studies.
Yeah, we did the same thing.
And a lot of kids need that. They're not going to sit still at a desk if they haven't had, and there's something about the outdoor, the way outdoors reacts with our senses. It's such a richer environment.
Exactly what I was going to say.
We're getting so much more stimulation and sensory practice, I guess you could say, sensory input. And so that plays another part in all of this.
It does. There were experiments where they mapped the brain with people on a treadmill versus people running outside. And the treadmill people, sorry to say, are kind of lulled into just very low levels of brain activity versus running outside, which is probably where I said I used to love running off trail and in unusual environments, because you do have so much sensory. I have seen that dramatically in especially a lot of kids with specific learning disabilities and with Asperger's or various forms of autism, that when they get an exercise like what you were talking about, the swerve, the balance, and they just latch onto it.
Yeah.
They know it's good. They know it's good.
They know they need it.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. We've seen that, which will segue into, I'll question you about cross-lateral movement, the importance of that. Do you think that is the actual cross-lateral motion is it?
Yes, actually that's cross-lateral motion. I used several exercises or techniques, I guess, of cross-lateral motion with my oldest son when he was struggling with dyslexia. And I do believe it helped quite a bit. There's a special ed teacher who ended up homeschooling her own son because he had a lot of dyslexia and learning disabilities. And so she developed this whole program of things you could do in your own home, which is great because not every parent has the money for the cost of some of these therapies, especially if it's a child who's sort of on the edge.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Maybe they're smart enough to make up for it. Maybe they're not going to get a diagnosis because they just function a little bit too well.
Yeah. But it makes sense, you know, so we're focusing on kids with specific learning disabilities and problems and like that. But I think that should make it pretty obvious that if they need it, that we all do, right?
Yeah, we did these things called figure eights. And actually, I didn't pick on that one son. I was just like, oh, we're all doing this. And we would all do the cross-lateral movements and motions.
I'm familiar with figure eights, yeah.
Yeah, and that way, he didn't feel picked on either. Nothing was wrong with him because he needed to do these things. We were all just making our brain stronger.
Doing the figure eights and then draw a letter and those exercises.
And some of them were just basic exercises like touch your elbow to your knee, let's see how fast we can crawl around the house. Yeah.
So where did that? Yeah, that stuff's really really popular. I'm familiar with all that. And who was that? Was that Diane Kraft that originally?
Diane Kraft, yeah.
Yeah, she was doing. I'm not sure if she's the originator of that, but it's also But I know she was one of the early ones.
She created a program based off a lot of the stuff she studied in college for special ed.
Okay.
And then, but now you can just, you can find even just free YouTube videos.
Oh, it's all over YouTube.
Yeah.
There's thousands and thousands of them, yeah. So,
but if you go back again, that's stuff children naturally do if they have sort of free space and free time.
They do. And that going back to the outdoor is, so if they're outdoor, they're climbing trees. So it's going to be cross-lateral and it's going to be problem solving, right?
Yeah.
Figuring out how to get your body up that tree or around the gymnasium, whatever. So the cross-lateral is actually how we got into this. So in the Kung Fu we do, it's just cross-lateral everything. And what's interesting about, what is very unique about what we do in the Kung Fu is that rather than like the Diane Kraft stuff, which is cross-lateral usually with one limb, or maybe sometimes a little bit too with like the cross crawls and that sort of thing.
A little
bit, yeah. More it's just one. It's mostly one. We're doing three limbs at a time and a lot of our motions. And with our adult, or even with all of our Kung students, we don't introduce with three because it blows your mind and you just want to. It's very, very difficult. But we do have processes of course, we use the concept of Kaizen, of very small changes and building it up to it. And, so just being a good teacher and that. And I'm sorry I'm taking over this conversation. We're on a subject that is just dear to me, right? But one of the motions we call cover outs is, and that's just getting away from your opponent after something has happened. But there's three cross-lateral motions in that, and it just is massive cognitive load to be able to do it. It takes us a long time to learn to teach somebody to do it because we have to go so step by step. But the point I was getting at is that all the dyslexic kids, all the ADHD kids, all the Asperger's kids, once we teach them that, and additionally, not only is it cross-lateral, but we're teaching eye stability at the same time.
Yeah.
My grandmaster used to say, it's your conning tower. If your conning tower is all over, you don't know how to command the ship, right? And so the eye stability of that is also an additional skill. So we would teach the eye stability in addition to all these cross-lateral motions in what are just normal Kung Fu. We were just doing this. This is just, to us 30 years ago, this was just Kung Fu.
Right.
And what happened was a school teacher, not a school teacher, a school principal brought his daughter in. He saw what we were doing, and then he sent every kid from the entire elementary school that had learning disabilities to us.
To you. That's awesome.
We had literally in a classroom of 50 kids, all with dyslexia, ADHD, all that. And if that was not a laboratory, I don't know what it was. So we observed this, and we're like, why are you doing this? He's like, it's because of your cross-lateral motion. And that's where I started to study it. And that's where I started to, because I could see the change in these kids over and over. And that was 20 years ago. I've been studying this ever since. But the thing that is particular about it is those kids, once they get like our cover outs and that, man, they know it's good for them. They won't stop doing it until they get it built in automatic.
Yeah.
So pretty amazing. So I'm going to quote you from your blog. It says, the choice is ours. Get busy moving with our kids or let the neurons die. Right.
Yeah, that's one of those lines that I almost deleted, and then I was like, nope. No, I'm just going to leave it.
Leave it. I'm glad you did.
That really is what happens.
You're right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of the research in this area is in the elderly, and they know that if they've done this, if we've done this throughout our life, that things like Alzheimer's and these degenerative diseases, it delays the onset of those. If we're going to get them at all, having more neurons, more white matter, denser gray matter delays that onset. Yeah. This is well known.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you posted that. So you've got one blog on there. Should we talk about, just briefly, let's not go too deep in this, but talking about the cerebrum, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, neurotrophic factor, white matter, and making the brain bigger. So you're talking about just jumping for those things. And that I know that jumping.
Oh, jumping, yeah.
I know that jumping is in a lot of the Diane Craft stuff, where she's having jumping and counting at the same time, or some type of mental activity while jumping. Yeah. Do you do that?
Yeah, we just jump in our house all the time. And it just started really with some of those things, but even now, we'll jumping jack spelling words,
right?
For example, and it sort of turns it into a chant. And in some ways, it's just you're doing two things at the same time. So you're helping increase your cognitive load, but you're also getting oxygen to the brain.
Yeah.
And you're also, doing all this cross wiring. Jumping. If we just jumped every day for a few hours, we'd all be super smart.
Well, especially if you're doing it in combination like you are.
I had those little mini trampolines in my house.
Yep.
Especially because I used to live up north where it'd be snowy and yucky weather. And we broke like 4 of those because our kids jumped so much on those little mini trampolines.
Good for you.
So if it's just one thing that a person can take away is just get your kids jumping.
Jumping and maybe counting at the same time, or counting backwards, or saying
or
the alphabet.
Anything. If they need to memorize some facts for school, just have them jump while they do it. And that makes it more interesting to them. Because they don't get to do that in school. It's suddenly novel, but also they're going to crave movement. Their bodies really just do crave movement. And so in that way, it's going to be more fun for them. And so just reciting things or quizzing on things while you're jumping, it's a great way to strengthen the brain, and it's a great therapy.
Yeah, really is simple. Right. So what is the first thing children need in order to be ready to learn?
To be relaxed.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
because their lower brain is concerned with safety and survival.
Yep.
And this part of the brain is going to block information from entering their higher brain if it doesn't feel safe.
Their amygdala is lit up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the first thing they need is to feel safe. And you can tell if they feel that way because it'll manifest as them being just sort of happy and comfortable.
Okay.
And so, like, even if, for a parent, if their child comes home from school in a stressed state, the first thing they have to do is fix that.
Yes.
They have to pull them out of the stressed state, get them to where they're happy and relaxed, whatever it is they need.
Mm-hmm.
They might need to talk about something that happened. They might need to get some exercise and move a bit. They might need food.
Okay.
Whatever they need till they're
Mm-hmm.
happy and relaxed. Then they're going to be able to actually learn from the homework they're doing. Otherwise, they're just going through motions and they're not really going to be retaining anything.
Right. Yeah, this is something we stress heavily. We talk about self-confidence as being the first thing, and the reason is having confidence keeps you out of those stressed states.
Right. Yeah.
It's such a big deal with, we've got some data we put together looking at submissions and just thousands, I don't know what my data set was, but it was like maybe 40,000 submissions. And it was very obvious that somewhere that, because we asked questions that we were not specifically asking if the kids were nervous or anxious or anything like that, but we were asking questions that would indicate that they probably are.
Right.
Had enough things that were saying they are, then we're like, they are. And then we asked, is your child, anxious or low self? Well, then the numbers that signified that they were, of the things that were not direct questions, were much higher than when the answers that said, yes, they're anxious. So parents weren't recognizing it as much as it was. And so we're the same thing, like in the learning success system. That's the first thing is developing confidence and using, there are other things like you mentioned, movement. So going back to the ballet and the Kung Fu, have you seen the Amy Cuddy's stuff on power posing and that?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of those.
Really one of the most popular TED Talks. And so, and she's not the only one. There's a lot of stuff around posture and our physiology and how that can change because it's a loop, right? So we can change that anxious feeling in our state. But if a kid is in if they're in anxiety, their prefrontal cortex shut down.
Yeah.
Right? There's no learning.
Yeah.
Okay, good. What should parents who have children struggling, and going back to that, if a kid is struggling in learning, they don't want anyone to find out, so they're automatically anxious.
Right.
They don't feel safe, which is what you said.
Yeah.
They don't feel safe. Right.
Yeah.
So it's an automatic. That's it's going to be there. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
what should parents who have children struggling with academics focus on at home?
We have a couple steps here. First, make sure they're getting enough movement and exercise. And actually, since we're assuming right now they have some anxiety because they're struggling with learning, exercise is a great therapy to relieve anxiety.
Yep.
So you're doing two things. You're getting enough oxygen and blood flow to the brain. You're encouraging it to build matter and neurons and just grow. And you're dealing with the anxiety. Second, check their diet. Maybe add in a few nutritionally dense foods. You can Google brain foods, especially omega-3s. Figure out how to make sure they're getting some. There are ways other than fish. And I don't encourage people to go down too many dietary rabbit holes because as a culture, we have this really weird relationship with food. But sometimes there are huge things you can do, whether it's adding or taking something away. Sometimes there's going to be a little key you can unlock there.
And it's a lot of personal. People are different, so you're gonna...
Right. It's troubleshooting. Really.
Right.
And third, make sure they feel loved. So we tend to take for granted that our kids know they love us. But the brain actually craves love. And so if we're playing with them, cuddling with them, reading to them, just make sure, because if they're in a state of anxiety for 6 hours every day at school, then they need extra.
Mm-hmm.
They need extra just hands-on support at home from you.
Right. Right. And it's going to raise oxytocin levels, which is going to.
Right. Yeah. And yes, that's going to get the neurotransmitters firing.
Sure,
and the dopamine and all those things that need to be in the right place too, which also in turn is going to dial their anxiety down again.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
You can think of it this way. If you're not getting enough oxygen to the brain, it doesn't matter how many times a child practices their math facts. They aren't going to remember them because the brain doesn't have the materials it needs to form the new path.
Okay.
Or neural connection.
Yeah.
So first focus on these foundations that are often the missing link when a child struggles with academics.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. What about smart children? I'm not to say,
Yeah.
I think that they're all smart, generally.
They are all smart, but
it's those
we
that are
label some as smart.
Yes. Okay. So yes, that's a better way to say it. Those that are labeled as smart.
Those that are labeled as smart.
What do you do with them to make sure
I worry about this more sometimes than the kids with learning disabilities because we're not paying attention to what these kids need. Smart kids are in danger of developing a fixed mindset.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Where they think everything should come easy. They get used to things being easy. And then at whatever point things become hard, they think they're not smart enough and quit.
Mm-hmm.
It might not happen until medical school. But I've heard countless stories of this where a kid graduated as a valedictorian, thought he was going to go to medical school, got to college, had one hard class, changed their major.
Yeah. I remember the moment I learned this, it was in a podcast listening to Carol Dweck, who was, I think, the originator of these ideas.
Yeah, so they need to be regularly pushed past their comfort zone. And a lot of times the parents are going to be the ones that have to do that. The school's not necessarily going to say anything about them. They're not a problem. They're fine. They're getting straight A's. They're not necessarily going to put them in an advanced class. Some schools might.
What are you going to do to push them?
The advanced class might not even push them.
Right.
I like to think about a few things that aren't just sort of plain academics to push them. One is creativity.
Okay.
The other is physical.
Mm-hmm.
Make them go do something that's physically hard, like kung fu or ballet.
Yep.
Because that requires, that's hard for every kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a third idea. My smart kid, I make him write a lot of stories.
Versus creativity, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because when you're creating, then you're gonna pull on all that information and be practicing connecting it in new ways, and it's just a higher level skill, but it's also something you can't just put the right answer down and be done with in 2 seconds.
Right. Right.
You have to actually go ahead and use that brain of yours. And they need to use their brains just like the other kids. And we're not necessarily helping them use them all the way when they're just skimming through school the entire time.
Yeah, and human brains want to be lazy.
Yes, we do like to avoid thought.
Yes. So I can see how important that is, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So we talked about memorization and that, but let's say, what role does memory play in the learning process?
Yeah, memories, it's just so misunderstood right now, I think, in our culture. It's essential to the learning process. In many ways, we don't really know something until it's in our memory banks.
Mm-hmm.
And just even this conversation is an example of that. We couldn't sit here and have this conversation if we hadn't studied and learned all these things for however many years.
Right. You can't make the connections.
I like thinking about how when we memorize something, it actually becomes a physical part of who we are. It becomes a part of our body. Our brain actually builds a road to the information inside of us.
I use the phrase when I'm teaching my students, I said, do you want to rent that or you want to own it?
Yes, I like that. Yeah. So without memory, we can't get very far. And that's because we can only hold a very limited amount of information in our working memory. And so we rely on our long-term memory to give us more tools and toys to play with, because we can pull up concepts and information and use it in our working memory and then dump it back out. So if we don't have those memory banks full, we just have a lot less stuff to play with in our brains.
Yeah, there's stuff on, on sleep, and that our brain is actually far more active when we sleep, and that's what it's doing.
Yes, yeah.
It's searching for all these weird connections, and and it appears to be because our dreams, can be really weird. It's like that's trying that out. It's trying new connections and all that, and it's actually more activity than when we're awake. So it might be important, right?
Yeah, it might be. Just might be.
So a lot of what is pushed on kids is when they're struggling is like more academics.
Yeah.
Right? Can we do that? Is that going to work? Can we give them more workbooks?
Well, not exactly. That's my answer. Not exactly.
You can come right out and say no. It's fine with me.
Usually if a child's having trouble with academics, there's something going on that's an underlying cause, and it's not a lack of workbooks. That's never your underlying cause, right? Most kids are getting a lot of practice with the academic skills they need. So if we're seeing them falling behind, the problem may be their brain needs something else in order to be able to form the connections that it should be forming. It could be a lack of physical building materials, such as oxygen, omega-3 fats, or the endorphins that keep our brain happy and healthy.
Dopamine. Yeah.
So I recommend actually focusing on those building blocks first. Give the brain all the materials it needs.
Right, the building blocks. Yeah, that makes sense. Without that, forget it. And then, I know
your child has all those things in place, then you can just give them some more drills. But I just want to point out that if you're creating an environment where the drills are creating stress,
yes,
their lower brain's just going to shut the information out again, and the drilling won't be effective.
Now they're going into that fight or flight mode.
So we still have to be creative and find ways to drill our child that they think are fun.
I tell you, we used to, going back to the Kung Fu analogy, so, you want to drill the basics a lot. And we would do, say, a snap kick. It's a basic forward kick, right? And we'd say, okay, we're going to practice our snap kicks and get to the point we'd stop before they got bored. And we're going to go, okay, now we're going to practice our snap kicks facing the other direction. And we turn around and do it. And then we're going to go, okay, now we're going to practice them facing to the right and the left. And then go, okay, let's all form a circle and we'll practice them facing in the center of the circle and now face the out. And you get the point.
Yeah.
We're doing the exact same thing over and over. And we could keep going an entire hour.
It's just amazing though, isn't it? That one little shift.
Yeah.
One little introduction of a new novelty. It wakes their brain back up and it keeps them interested.
Yeah.
It's really not really as hard to make it interesting as...
It's not.
I think we think it's hard, but it's not once you just start doing it.
Oh, we would laugh about it, about how easy, when we figured this out, about how easy it really is.
Yeah.
It's amazingly easy. So let's talk about, we've talked about this also, but will your slow kid always struggle?
Well, the more a child learns, the easier learning becomes. Our brains actually get better at learning as we retain many facts from a subject, we get better at doing more complicated things with those facts. However, kids who are not struggling are also practicing learning and will be getting better. So whether they're going to catch up to their peers, that throws another wrench in. For a child that is behind to catch up to their peers, they have to do more and learn more to get more information in their brains because they're not starting from the same place. But once they catch up, a child who struggles, if they work hard and they catch up in a supporting, loving environment, because they're not going to catch up without that supporting environment in place that's nurturing and making sure they have all those pieces they need, they can catch up.
And now they're going
it might
faster.
Depend on the cause. Some kids may have lifelong struggles that are more severe, but in truth, we don't really know how much they will struggle later. All we can do is give them everything they need and then see what happens. And we're not doing that for the vast majority of children. We're not giving them all the building blocks they need and then seeing what happens. We're just shutting them down where they are.
Right. Going back to that old, the first thing we touched on, we make an assumption of intelligence. This is where it is. And if you keep with that assumption, then there you are, right?
Right.
Yeah. And again, going over, will my smart kid ever be challenged? We've touched on these, but we've touched on how you challenge your kid with creativity, and that's
and then just being grateful when they do get challenged. Maybe in 8th grade it gets hard for them. Maybe it happens before medical school. The parents' viewpoint at that point should be to embrace the challenge, encourage your smart kid, tell them, this stuff is really hard. It makes perfect sense that you're struggling, but I know that if you just work hard at it, it's going to get easier and you can figure it out. You'll be fine.
So
they need you to walk them through the process of the growth mindset.
Because it's new to them.
Yeah.
It's new. Yeah. That makes sense. If I see where your concerns are. You said early on that you're almost more concerned with the smart children, that without developing that growth mindset, they could run into big trouble. And I've seen that myself. Yeah. Very, very good point. How do we make information sticky?
So I use this term quite a bit on my blog, sticky, because we want the stuff they're learning to stay in there. We want it to be sticky. So I like to think of our complex neural networks as like a spider web. And when our child encounters new information, the brain needs to know where to put it. Which web should this information be sticking to?
Okay.
And so it needs to know how the new information relates to things the child already knows.
Okay.
And this sounds basic, but it's actually something I think we inadvertently skip a lot of times. We skip the step where we connect things that they already know to new things.
Okay.
And the more things a child already knows and understands, then the easier it is for the new information to find multiple places to stick. But this is also why we want to go through and show them patterns and connections between subjects on purpose, so that
and developing
that little bit of information is stuck to 3 spiderweb wires instead of just 1.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't do that, we might just be flinging it into an empty spot and it's just going to fall right out. It's not going to stay in their brain at all because they don't have anywhere to put it. Their brain doesn't know what to do with it.
You have no, there goes
there's no framework.
The neurons that wire together, fire together, right? If there's more neural networks connecting to that, then it becomes sticky.
Yeah.
I get it. Right. And so that creates kind of the whole brain then becomes sticky.
Right. So we can make the whole brain sticky because as we're building all this web, it gets thicker and there's more strands overlapping and connecting. And soon there's so much information there that new information is going to stick fairly easily, even if it's just sort of flung. It's going to find several places where it can just go. And that's why in some ways adults do learn more easily.
Right, because our brain's always going,
We have
this
a
is,
lot of places to just tuck it into.
yeah, the brain's
Yeah.
always saying, this is like this in this way, or like this
Yeah, and that's
in another
probably
way.
why learning gets easier the more we learn. Our brain just gets so sticky.
That's very nice. Very beautiful thought. I like that. Yeah, which is very contrary to a lot of beliefs that, thinking about our brain having a finite amount of storage area. And yeah, you roll your eyes. This is a podcast, so I'm going to state she just rolled her eyes for good reason. Because how many people, you hear that with older adults all the time, I'm running out of space. They have this idea that it's, and if you really, I think you've pointed out in your blog that the I don't know, billions of neurons we have, and then each one of those is connected. I don't know what the numbers are as far as how many connections.
They're big.
Are, but they're
Yeah.
bigger than we can imagine, right?
Yes, bigger than we can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So what do you have when a child just is lazy in their thinking and they don't want to think?
Yeah. Well, thinking is hard. And I think we forget that. And the way we have our culture set up, we're expecting our kids to think for a large part of the day. We're expecting them to think. Although people are curious, we don't necessarily like working hard.
So do you think that the ability to think for long periods is a skill that has to be built then?
I think children will think for long periods if they can succeed.
Okay.
And if there's a problem to solve, because we like to solve problems. And we can see that just with the human fascination for puzzles and games. Those are all problem solving. But if we think that a problem's too hard, we're not going to want to think about it. And answers are not interesting.
Right.
So if we're just expecting them to think about answers, that's not interesting by itself.
Okay.
So I really like to separate learning facts and skills from learning content, because they should get different strategies. Learning facts and skills, you should be memorizing things with fun things, songs, jumping jack drills, whatever you need to do to make it fun.
Because the facts
right.
are inherently
learning
boring.
Content, it's great to ask a child a question and then don't give them the answer right away. But when you do that, you want to make sure they actually have some pieces of information in their brain already so that they could get to the answer. Because if you're always presenting questions that they can't answer yet because you didn't give them the tools, they're not going to like questions anymore, and they're going to stop answering. And we actually see a pattern like that through the grades, I believe, in school.
Okay.
Where fewer and fewer children will raise their hands to answer a question as they go up in grade levels.
Because the training is...
Because we're training them. We're training them that we're going to ask something that's actually too hard.
Okay. So there should be a level of hardness.
An attainable challenge.
Right. So slightly outside of their comfort.
Right, right. And adults are like this too. We do things that are just a little bit tricky for us. We don't do things that we feel are completely out of our current knowledge or abilities. We push ourselves just a little bit farther as we learn new things.
Yeah. There's talk about that concept of being just outside of that zone, of then getting into, what's called the state of flow, or some people call it the zone, or whatever.
The flow or the zone, yep.
Yeah, and so if you can get that mix right, toward you're just a little harder than we've done before, just a little out, then that gets that flow state going. And you find that in, it definitely happens in martial arts. I was talking to somebody the other day about that in motorcycle, that's why motorcycle riders like it so much, because they're pushing right to that limit of which is cognitive.
Yeah, right to the edge.
Right to the edge. Yeah. And there's some risk involved at that edge level, and there's risk in learning too. I mean, there's, depending on your growth mindset, the risk is, looking at it or not.
Right.
If they
Yeah.
don't have a good growth mindset, it's still risk either way. So
Yeah.
interesting. So how should a parent know when their child is just being lazy? Because you hear that a lot, like, not working up to their
Potential.
Yeah, there it is.
Their potential, this perceived potential that the parents are sure they have.
What exactly is potential? It's a thing. It's a concrete thing, right? No.
Yeah. This is just such a common question. Parents wondering if they're lazy or if they actually have a problem. But I don't think kids are lazy actually very often, really. In general, they have a lot of energy and they want to be busy doing things.
Right. It's not logical to think.
The problem is often not laziness, but the brain crying out for something else it needs, something other than homework.
Okay.
It's their brain really needs to move most of the time. Sometimes they might be hungry.
Right.
They might need to go outside and get actual sensory stimuli from the real world.
So that really should be.
While their brain's craving this thing, the brain's just not interested in letting them do their math facts. While the brain's like, okay, it's been hours and hours since you gave me these other things, I need them now. And it just sort of shuts them down. And you just see it for many kids doing homework's much easier if they've been playing hard for a while.
Right.
Getting out the physical energy just puts their brain in the state where it's ready to sit down and let them think. But I would also steer away from diagnosing something like laziness with academic work. If a child's lazy, look to what they do in their free time, chores you assign them to complete, and extracurricular activities. If you see laziness in everyday life, then maybe they are just being lazy with their schoolwork.
Okay.
However, I would steer clear of accusing them of being lazy. I wouldn't say to the child, you're just being lazy, do this worksheet.
You're creating that.
I cure laziness with physical work.
Okay.
And I think part of the problem with laziness is just that they actually need to move more, again. So I give them chores.
Yeah.
If I think it's a character issue, I will give them more chores to do, and that will be based off usually whether or not they're doing what they are already assigned as far as chores goes well. Because chores, you can see. You cannot actually see in your child's brain. You might think if they're just being lazy, but there might be more complicated things going on in their brain that you're not aware of. Whereas you can see if they just, took one swipe on the table instead of wiping the whole thing down.
Okay, so then at that point it's a character.
Right, it's a character issue, and I find it does overflow. So you just deal with it with something visible that you can measure. Okay, you can measure how well they cleaned the table. And you fix it that way, and it will carry over into how they apply themselves to their schoolwork.
That's really smart. That's great. Because it can be lazy. It is possible.
Yes, some kids are lazy, but you'll see it in other places. It won't just be in their academic work. So I think that's a good way of figuring out if it's just laziness or if they're having a struggle with their brain.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the ways that like ADHD is diagnosed. Are they that way everywhere? Right?
Yeah.
Do they? Yeah. And if not, it's not ADHD, right?
Right.
Yeah. So interesting. Okay, great. We have covered a tremendous amount. It's been really interesting for me. I hope that parents get a lot out of this. I'm sure they will.
Yeah.
This is really critical stuff. Is there anything else that we should bring up? Have we missed on anything important?
I guess I just want to stress that we need to pay attention to their stress levels, and that stress doesn't necessarily manifest the same way in kids.
And we're talking about bad stress.
Right. Kids are supposed to be happy. It's their natural state.
Sure.
And we need to work harder to notice when something's off and help them work through it and find ways to relieve their stress so that they can be in the sort of default state of being happy and relaxed, and not in a default state of feeling like they're dumb or being anxious over every grade they get.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so parents want to learn more from you, so your blog, jumpintogenius.com.
Jumpintogenius.com. Yep.
Is that where people should go? I know you're on Medium as well.
I am on Medium. I would say I write about more topics on Medium.
Okay.
And sometimes I write directly just to parents versus necessarily towards homeschoolers on Medium. So parents might want to go ahead and follow me on Medium.
Okay. And that's at, what's it?
That's at Marla Szwast. That's my actual name.
Okay, I will put that link in there because that's
going to be hard to spell.
For tough spellers, for those who don't have spelling down. I've had to look at your last name several times because it took me a while.
Yes.
So we'll put those links below. Okay, this has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Learning Success Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it. We also hope you have learned something useful, something that you can take back and improve your life with today. If you would like to say thank you, the best way for you to do that is to share this podcast with a friend. Help us help others along this journey. And if you haven't already, please rate and comment on the podcast. Every rating helps us and helps this podcast get out to more people. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you. Thank you again, and make today a great day. No one should have to live with a learning difficulty.